But right now, I've talked about this a lot, and I talked about it when it happened. Back in 2013, when Bob Mueller was still the head of the FBI, before he had left that job under President Obama, a story broke about the FBI basically cleansing its records and its anti-terrorism training material from anything that might be perceived as offensive to Muslims. And I thought that was pretty interesting. I've asked Sean Dunagan to join us. He is a senior investigator with Judicial Watch, which is the group that put together this report back in 2013 after looking over these new guidelines for the FBI. Sean, how are you?
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you for giving us a little bit of time today. Your organization, which, just by the way, I'll just a little plug, does great work on behalf of the American people. Going out and asking for information from the Department of Justice and many others. And without your efforts, I'm convinced we wouldn't have gotten some of the answers we have on some of the Clinton email investigations and Benghazi and so many other issues. But on this issue, Judicial Watch issued a report in 2013 about the government purging law enforcement training material deemed offensive to Muslims. And Bob Mueller was at the head of the FBI when all that happened. What can you tell me about that report?
Right. Well, Bob Mueller was not only the head of the FBI, the meetings, he actually was the one who personally had meetings with representatives of these Muslim groups that found some materials that the FBI was using to train its agents to be offensive. So Bob Mueller had these meetings with representatives of the Muslim Public Affairs Council and the Islamic Society of North America. And those groups, the representatives of those groups, flagged certain things that the FBI was saying about radical Islam and the link to terrorism. And he turned right around and struck those in the training materials. So there were almost 1,000 pages that were taken out of what the FBI was using to train its agents, and a few hundred presentations that were deleted or altered to satisfy these Muslim advocacy groups.
Wow. So, for example, can you give me some examples of some of the material that was removed out of fear of offending the Muslim Brotherhood or the Council on American Islamic Relations?
Yeah, absolutely. And, that's really what makes this story, I think, noteworthy. There was nothing in those materials that said, Muslims are bad or all Muslims are terrorists or anything like that. Some of the specific concerns that they had, for instance, were references to the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. Well, in a number of countries in the world, including Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood is designated as a terrorist organization. It's not in the U.S., but some of its offshoots, like Hamas, are designated terrorist organizations. But, somehow these groups found it offensive that the FBI would link the Muslim Brotherhood to terrorism. Another one was some of the training materials made reference to the fact that the 1993 World Trade Center bombing was an al-Qaeda plot. Right? So the group said, no, you can't put that in there. Right? That's, slandering al-Qaeda, I guess. Well, we now know that the mastermind of that, Ramzi Youssef, had trained at an al-Qaeda camp in Afghanistan and actually lived at a house in Pakistan owned by Osama bin Laden. Right? But somehow it's offensive to draw that link between the 93 attack on the World Trade Center and al-Qaeda, same to the Khobar Towers attack in Saudi Arabia. So it's really counterfactual. What the FBI did to satisfy Muslim advocacy groups was to take actual information that would be useful in providing historical background about terrorism to its agents out of those training materials, which is really what's so offensive.
Yeah, so we effectively cleansed it. We're talking to Sean Dunagan from Judicial Watch. Sean, I'm having a little bit of trouble hearing you. Sound a little muffled. Maybe it's our phone line here. I apologize for that. If that's if that's the case, I was having a little trouble understanding a little part of what you said there. But in terms of Mueller leading this, correct me if I'm wrong, but I read an article today that said at one point earlier in his career, he had agreed that the Muslim Brotherhood was a terrorist organization, but then turned around and kind of cleansed that language from FBI training manuals, correct?
That's right. And, it wasn't much earlier. It was actually in 2011 when then Director Mueller made that statement that the Muslim Brotherhood supported terrorism overseas. And it was only 2012 that the meeting occurred and the purges to the curriculum were made. So, it was clearly an about-face. One would assume that was a result of political pressure from the Obama administration and from the Department of Justice. We don't know that for sure, but it sure looks like it, because he changed his opinion about the group more or less on a dime.
I'm thinking back to the Major Nidal Hassan attack at Fort Hood, and the fact that instead of calling it what it was, we called it workplace violence. I mean, as you look back in more and more cases like that, and some of us called it out at the time, but it seems more and more obvious there was almost an intentional policy flowing through the previous administration to try to whitewash some of this violence or attitude of violence by some elements of the Muslim religion.
Oh, I don't think there's any question. The notion that is run-of-the-mill workplace violence is absurd. And clearly the only thing that made that attack different is the fact that it was, an act of Islamic terrorism. And what's interesting is Hassan was inspired by Anwar al-Awlaki, who's an American-born cleric who went on to become al-Qaeda's chief propagandist. Before al-Awlaki was al-Qaeda's chief propagandist, he was an imam at the largest mosque in the United States in Northern Virginia. And one of the complaints that the Muslim advocacy groups that met with Mueller had, and one of the changes he made, was to remove any references to mosques as incubators of radicalization.
Oh.
Well, not every mosque, but there are an awful lot of mosques in the United States, and an awful lot of clerics in the United States that preach jihad and that financially and morally support Islamic terrorism. But, that's another thing that had to be stricken from the record and from the training materials that the FBI used.
It's stunning. I'm assuming this report is still available on your website. Is that correct?
It is, absolutely. And, we certainly invite your listeners to read it. Most of what we do is document-based. We don't make wild speculation or political arguments. We have the documents. You can read them. This is what transpired in those meetings, and this is what Bob Mueller did as a result of them. The report is there. It's extremely well documented and sourced, and I think it's interesting. I think particularly with Mueller's elevation to the position of special counsel, it's noteworthy, and I think that's important because what the report describes is Mueller's part and Mueller's targeting as part of an influence operation that was conducted by Islamists, right? And now he's been appointed to a position where his sole function is to investigate an influence operation. And yet, just a few short years ago, he was an unwitting victim of one. So I think it's relevant. I think it's relevant to the work he'll be doing in Russia Probe.
That is a great point. Sean Dunagan with Judicial Watch. I direct people to the website judicialwatch.org to read more on this report from December 9th of 2013. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, happy Friday. Thank you, Sean. Did you hear what he said there?